everyone. Welcome to the Film Element Podcast. I'm once again your host, Mike Gallant, and welcome back. It's been a few weeks. It's been maybe a month even since I've last done or at least posted a podcast, and I don't really have a really good reason for why that is. My life certainly got a little bit busy in the last little while. I started working on this film that I can't really talk too much about yet, but I was hired to be an editor on it. It's a psychological horror film, a vampire film, which is really cool, and it has some cool actors that from my childhood and from people's current childhoods that are children and are growing up, maybe enjoying the MCU. So yeah, it's been a really busy time the past like couple of months. So you're all probably wondering, and by you all, I mean the one or two people who maybe listen to this regularly. I don't know. Hopefully, there's more people out there than there used to be. But uh, you're all probably wondering what brought Mike back into the fold. What was something that he just had to talk about? And I'm going to speak about a film from my childhood. Uh, and this is an idea that was floated to me by some family members about possibly doing sort of a retro film review. So don't just do film reviews about current films that are out in the movie theaters. Do reviews of films from maybe the 90s or beloved uh, franchises that I'm sure have been talked about 10 times over, but maybe I have something to offer in a little different perspective. And the film I'm going to be talking about is the 1998 Michael Bay epic Armageddon. And listen, I know that Armageddon has a slew of haters out there, and it's one of those films you can't really argue with people who don't like Armageddon. It is, in a lot of ways, very, very dumb, and it's very jingoistic. And if you're not a red blooded American, or maybe you even have issues, maybe you are American and you have issues with the current administration or all the administrations, and you're just an anarchist, I can totally understand why you don't buy into Armageddon as well and what they're selling. Um, I mean, Armageddon is probably one of the most quote unquote patriotic films I can think of without being straight up propaganda. And in some ways, it basically is straight up propaganda. But then again, so was Top Gun and Top Gun Maverick, especially. And that was the number one film, or almost the number one film when it came out. Now, fun fact about Armageddon that I don't think a lot of people are aware of, Armageddon was actually the number one film of 1998. And that wasn't something I was aware of, but when I started doing some research on it, I was blown away that it was, in fact, the amount of money it had made shocked me. Because, like I said, I personally love the film. And I love it unironically, unabashedly. And we watched it a couple of days ago, and there was a lot about it that sort of blew me away, especially with the perspective of today's modern blockbuster filmmaking and sort of what we have had to contend with the last 5, 10, 15 years in the box office. You know, Armageddon, for all of its faults, certainly has an aspect of when you watch it, you say, why don't they make movies like this anymore? And obviously, there are faults about it, and there are some really fun faults that I am excited to talk about because I think there are angles about this that either don't get discussed um, uh, or just haven't been thought of. And I'm actually really excited to jump into that, but I'll get to that very shortly. Uh, the reason I love Armageddon, it's for all the reasons you guys probably love it. It's big. It's just, uh, it's lunatic filmmaking, I would say. You know, as an editor, a film editor, some of the sequences that are cut together, especially the action scenes, especially up in space, um, when during, let's say, the rock storm, or when the ships are coming around the moon and they have to trail behind the asteroid and deal with the debris, and then one of the ships goes down. Spoiler alert, this is going to be a very spoiler heavy retro review, so just be prepared for that. But yeah, I love it for all the reasons that you love it. And I watched it. This was probably the first time I saw it in 4K. I watched it, I think it was on Amazon, and they had a 4K stream of it. Now, obviously, you can argue how good is the 4K conversion on Amazon. I'm not going to get into that. But yeah, so I don't think I had seen it that cleanly. I don't even know if I've ever watched it on a DVD or a Blu-ray. Maybe on television, an HD televised screening of it, but I don't. I'm very much used to the VHS that I owned and watching that version and watching it, way too many times throughout, pre-high school and high school. This was just something that we watched all the time. The guys loved it, the girls loved it, for completely different reasons. But it was one of those 4 quadrant films, you know, and I was trying to figure out, I'm like, this is probably the biggest natural disaster movie that's ever been made. Not only in scope and scale, but just in box office specifically and in sort of iconic memory. Now, I don't consider, movies like Independence Day, which actually has a very similar feel to Armageddon. And you can sort of see, especially when I was watching it with modern eyes, you can see the spiritual connection that those two movies have. And of course, obviously, the hilarious timing of Deep Impact, which was the other asteroid slash comet hitting the Earth movie that, was way, way less successful. And you can kind of understand why. It tried to be too high minded. Which is a shame. You kind of wish that someone had combined the sort of patience and the nuance and the scientific accuracy of Deep Impact with the gonzo, jingoistic, crowd-pleasing energy of Armageddon. And, unfortunately, they're just two they're two opposite ends of the spectrum, and one worked and one didn't. And, Armageddon doesn't work for a lot of people, and that's completely understandable. I can completely understand why people don't appreciate it. And I think when I was watching it this time around, I was blown away by the practicality, like the practical effects. I am very disheartened with a lot of modern filmmaking, especially modern big budget filmmaking, and their over reliance on, visual effects. And I don't mean special effects. I mean specifically visual effects, stuff that is generated in computer. So actually visual effects cannot mean computer, but I mean specifically computer generated effects. I had just seen Mandalorian and Grogu. A film I was not very impressed by, but I was very much let down by some of the visual effects, specifically the Hutts. There are several Hutt characters, like Jabba the Hutt, and they were all CG, and not one of them was convincing at any specific time. And it's 2026, and we can't see. And we had a far more convincing alien in 1983 than we do in 2026, and I think that's a failure. I think the way we're heading with modern filmmaking is a failure, and I understand that there are things, and I will say, I mean, this is supposed to be about Armageddon. I'm talking about Mandalorian and Grogu, but I would just say one last thing. Mandalorian and Grogu, the Mandalorian specifically, that franchise made its bones on the practicality of Grogu specifically. They said, listen, you're not going to get a digital Yoda like you've gotten in the prequels. We're going to go back to basics, and we're going to do a fairly unconvincing puppet but the puppet is going to have its own aesthetic that you're just going to buy into. We know it's not going to look like it's actually real, but and it obviously it is real, but it definitely just looks like some guy's hand up a puppet, even worse than Yoda was. The puppeteering of Grogu is actually worse than Yoda, but there is just something about it that captivated the world, at the earlier part of this decade. Um, so to go back to Armageddon, that's one of the great things about Armageddon is that we're seeing that old school. We got to get it in camera. We got to get it in the can. And fortunately, Michael Bay has actually been pretty good about that and pretty consistent. He likes to shoot everything that he can get in the camera without having to jazz it up too much with unconvincing CGI. Obviously, the Transformer films were heavily CGI, but there's also a lot of practical effects that went around those monsters that helped convince them that they were there. And Armageddon to me is no different. You just I was blown away, for instance, how good the New York sequence was. There's a couple of shots when the Empire State Building is falling, and in a movie theater, it feels cool, looks cool, but ultimately, it doesn't look very convincing. But the explosions of the bus blowing up and all of these taxi cabs and all these different buildings exploding is really, really, really well done and well edited, and just does a great job convincing you that this is a real meteor shower. And there's other sequences that look better than others. Obviously, sometimes the shuttles in space flying behind the asteroid looked good. Sometimes it didn't. And they did use miniatures with the ships when they're landing on the asteroid, even though sometimes that didn't look very convincing. But you have to appreciate that approach because, especially in 1998, as good as visual effects were starting to become, they couldn't do things like that. Nowadays, unfortunately, that's all they would do is use computer-generated imagery to get those kind of effects. And, at the very least, I think we should encourage at least a mixture of both, with miniatures or because things just, the physics of shooting something practically just feel different. And I know I'm getting into the weeds and I'm waxing poetically about filmmaking, but it's something I truly believe. When you watch the space sequences, let's say from Return of the Jedi, knowing that everything was a model and was superimposed on top of each other and not just digitally created over and over again, there's something tangible about that, even 40 years later, that, and I'll go back to The Mandalorian specifically, it just doesn't catch you the same way that the modern CGI spaceships and space battles and all that stuff look. Now, obviously, some of it they just have to do. I understand that there's a certain level that has to be done with CGI. I get all that. But I'm saying I feel like we're losing something. And Armageddon, to me, had that old school, it was sort of this great in-between point where stuff was right down the middle. A lot of the digital effects in that film are really great. The sequence when Paris is blown up by a giant asteroid, I was shocked at how good that still looked after all of these decades. That film now is almost 30 years old and 28 years old, something like that. 1998, what is it, 2026? Yeah, so it's about 28 years old. And that looks good. And I think, I think another aspect of what makes Armageddon work, at least for me, is that there is this heart to the center of it. The characters, as one-dimensional as a lot of them are, because what more do you need than them just giving us an it's an entertaining team, right? It's like the Ocean's 11 team coming together. It's like we just need characters that fit a very funny archetype. and every single one of them is vibrant, right? We have Owen Wilson being Owen Wilson before he was Owen Wilson. You know, a lot of really great Owen Wilsonisms come out of Armageddon. Steve Buscemi, I mean, that role is iconic, and he's at the top of his game in that film with all of these really great funny moments, and he's just this weaselly uh, little dude with just these great reactions and great. One of my favorite moments is when the gun is pointing at, I think Bruce Willis, or Bruce Willis is someone's pointing. Oh, I think Chick is pointing the gun at the astronauts, and he opens the door and he's like, "All right, what'd we miss?" You know, I think he's incredible. Ben Affleck being, his romantic heartthrob self. Liv Tyler not basically just having to watch this mission from Earth, but also being the heart and soul that these men end up fighting for. And obviously Bruce Willis. I mean, Bruce Willis doing his John McClane thing on an asteroid, and just being exactly what we need him to be in this film. There's a lot of other obviously Michael Clark Duncan is really funny and really great. He broke out with that film as well, and I don't know the names of the other actors. Keith David, I really like in this as the general who says the line. I won't repeat it, but basically says how all of this money on defense and the fate of the world is in the hands of these R words, which gets bleeped out when it was on television. And Billy Bob Thornton, obviously being a really great Ed Harris archetype. The funny thing about Armageddon, I feel like it was the culmination of films like Apollo 13 and Independence Day, and it was just this really fun amalgamation of sort of those storylines, right? Those aesthetics. And I will even argue it's a little more like Independence Day than we're meant to believe, and I'll get into that in a second. But those aspects of it I really like. The music, too, is something that's really interesting because it's a lot more melodic and heartfelt than I think most films of this type usually are. Usually on an action film, especially as someone as, red-blooded as Michael Bay, who did The Rock and Bad Boys, you would expect sort of this 90s cold, adrenaline-pumping music, which a lot of it does have, but then it has this really tender, really really pulls at your heartstrings. There's these violin chords, and Trevor Rabin is the composer, and I like almost every track that has on that soundtrack is just incredible. And it's something that never gets talked about with this movie, and I think it deserves a lot more credit because a lot of this film is dismissed by, haters is the wrong word, but I think more cynical people who don't believe in the U.S. government, and obviously you're fine to have that call. I wouldn't begrudge anyone who feels that way, but I think this film, it aspires to something that obviously we know doesn't really exist, but it'd be great if just for one moment it did. Like if an asteroid was hurtling towards the Earth, wouldn't it be great if we as a people came together in a way that might seem overly optimistic, but just because people think that way doesn't mean we can't explore that. And I'm fine with that film, with Armageddon, sort of tapping into that, as like I said, as optimistic as that might be, or naive, I guess is a better word. So the storyline of Armageddon is interesting because I'm going to start getting into what is really, really dumb about this movie. And the one thing I'm going to say about Armageddon that is not as dumb as we used to think it was is, okay, so there's a viral clip online of Ben Affleck doing the audio commentary on one of the DVDs for Armageddon. And clearly, I don't think I'm even allowed to say this publicly, but in the captions I read, he's had a few. He's had a few drinks, and he definitely sounds like he's a little incapacitated during the audio commentary. But basically, he says he starts making fun of the film, and he said to Michael Bay at one point, he goes, "I don't understand why is NASA using deep core oil drillers to blow up an asteroid when it would be much easier to train the astronauts to be deep core oil drillers." Now, I have no idea if that's true. And for decades, I've heard exactly what Ben Affleck has talked about, that it is completely impossible to train people off the street to be astronauts, even if it's on an asteroid with gravity, than it is the reverse. Now, I would argue, in today's world, I 100% believe if there was an asteroid heading towards us, and this was what we had to do, in the world of, how fucked up things are in this planet and these administrations and whatever, that is exactly what would happen. I don't for a second not believe that the government would force NASA to go find oil drillers who are salt of the earth, even. And listen, as much as everyone criticizes the movie for it, the movie criticizes the idea as well. The whole tension is that these guys are not astronauts and they shouldn't be there. The whole film revolves around how bad of an idea this actually is, but when you're painted into a corner, what are you going to do? With the planet on the line, what are you going to do? And yes, Bruce Willis does give some rant about how the Boy Scouts aren't going to be, these Boy Scout astronauts are not going to be able to become oil drillers overnight. I mean, who knows? I don't know. I'm not an astronaut, and I'm not a deep core oil driller either. So I don't know which job is harder to train. I don't know who you would need more. But that to me is actually one of the more plausible things about this film. And I know everyone says the opposite, but I actually believe in today's world, that's exactly what would happen. Anyway, I'm going to move on from that. What I enjoy, I am big into astronomy and celestial bodies and space and all that sort of stuff. I'm sort of a space nerd. So I know a few things about the planets in our solar system. Not a lot, but I believe the basics. And once you start researching and figuring out, okay, so that's obviously, the implausibility of the oil drillers being the astronauts, is that plausible? I believe it is. Many people disagree. Where the scientific inaccuracies really just go off a cliff, and this is angles that I don't think a lot of people would anticipate, is I want to talk about the asteroid itself. And I am going to make the argument that not only is this not an asteroid, I don't even think I would argue this is a sentient being. I think Armageddon is actually a first contact movie, and it's never spoken about. But I believe that the asteroid is, at the very least, a ship, or on the other end of the spectrum, a living being a la Galactus or something of similar size. And here's the reason I make this argument. I think the script of Armageddon is good, very good, and very bad at the exact same time. And where it gets good. Now, people might be surprised to know this. J.J. Abrams of Star Trek fame was one of the writers. He's credited as one of the writers of Armageddon. I didn't know that until I just watched it recently. So where does the writing go right? I think the psychology of deep core oil drillers may or may not be accurate. I think the characterization of Billy Bob Thornton's character is similar. I think the government usurping NASA to just detonate the bomb themselves, as stupid as an idea as that, I believe that could happen. I 100% believe that could happen. And then there's a lot of really great NASA jargon. And, you can criticize the writing of this film all you want. I'm like, would you know how to write a scene like that? With NASA scientists saying this, talking about O2, Capcom, Freedom, all these different things, all this shuttle lingo. And the actors are doing it believably, so they're being directed well enough. No one in those roles, do you believe, is not capable of doing what they're doing. So I also give the movie credit there. Where I think this film falls apart on scientific inaccuracy really intensely and leads to my hypothesis about the asteroid. I think at some point the asteroid was much smaller in the script, and I think either Deep Impact, they got word that Deep Impact was landing on a comet, and they said, we can't also land on a comet. At the very least, it has to be an asteroid. And Michael Bay turned to Jerry Bruckheimer, or I'm assuming it went in this dynamic, and he said, there is no way I'm filming this crazy action movie on some boring-ass asteroid. Because every asteroid that we're aware of is not geologically active. They are boring. They are just rocks. Nothing has changed on them for millions of years. We have thousands of asteroids in our solar system alone that we're well aware of, and none of them have changed since we've been observing them. So he turned to him and he said, there's no way I'm doing this movie on a boring ass asteroid. I'm convinced. I have no evidence of this, but I just have to follow the logic, because it doesn't make sense. And Michael Bay turned to him, and I'm sure he said, so what are we going to do? And Michael Bay said, we're going to do some hybrid that no one's ever seen. That's the only thing I can imagine, because it doesn't make sense otherwise. It must have been a comet initially, because everything in the story revolves around it being a comet. And Deep Impact came out before Armageddon. People don't realize that. And someone must have got word and said, we have to change this ASAP. Michael Bay said, all right, go in the script, delete comet, put asteroid. And they said, but an asteroid, this isn't an asteroid. And he said, shut up. And they said, okay, all right, so it's an asteroid, but it's a geologically active asteroid with gas and ice. And he looked at him and he said, are you sure this isn't just a comet? And he said, no, it's an asteroid. He said, okay, this isn't an asteroid by definition, but sure. And Michael Bay said, how small are comets? And he said, well, maybe 10 kilometers max. We've never observed giant comets before. And he said, great, because we've observed giant asteroids. So we're going to make the asteroid much bigger. And Jerry said, how big are we going to make this asteroid? And he said, much bigger, much, much bigger. And he said, okay, how big? He goes, how big is Texas? And he's like, I don't know, about 1,000 to 1,300 kilometers across. He's like, fucking perfect. Doesn't make any sense. We have no asteroid. Okay, so actually that's not true. We have an asteroid in our asteroid belt. It's called Ceres. It's the biggest asteroid in the solar system. It's 900 kilometers across. So this asteroid that these people have to land on is bigger than the biggest asteroid we've observed in our solar system. For context, most moons around most of our planets are smaller than this asteroid. I would say the vast majority of them are smaller than this asteroid. The only geologically active moons in our solar system are Jupiter's 4 giant moons, which are almost dwarf planets. And I don't even think Titan around Saturn is geologically active anymore. But a lot of that geological activity comes from Jupiter's gravity, strong gravity. Now, when you see the tail of a comet, usually that's happening because it's getting closer to the sun. It's warming up, the gases are starting to escape, the ice is starting to melt. So that's usually what the tail of a comet is, and what creates that tail. Now, in Armageddon, when the asteroid passes across the moon, which I might add, it is 1/3 the size of. For context, the moon is about the size of the United States. And according to this movie, the asteroid is the size of Texas. So that's about 1/3 the size of the moon. Now, one funny thing about this film is that it says we have to keep this asteroid under wraps. And the reality is an asteroid that big, which has never been seen before in our solar system, but is the biggest asteroid that we've ever seen. It would be observable with the naked eye for weeks before it even arrived on Earth. So this whole idea that we could hide, A, we could hide that this asteroid exists, and B, that we wouldn't be able to see it in the first place. I did some calculations. This asteroid coming towards Earth at that size, it would have been viewable for decades. It argue maybe even centuries. But let's give the movie some benefit of the doubt and at least say decades. That is insane. And I want you to understand, it was traveling fast, but not light speed. The space shuttle was able to catch it in between the moon and the Earth. Now, light speed between the moon and the Earth is, I think, about a couple seconds. So it wasn't traveling faster than light, or at light speed, or even anywhere close to light speed. We were able to catch them with our modern rockets, even with the slingshot around the moon. So something moving that slowly, you would have seen it, like I said, for decades. And let's also talk about the meteor shower and shrapnel, quote unquote, that it creates, weeks before it arrives. I mean, that can't possibly happen. That doesn't even make any sense. First of all, what a lot of people don't realize is that our asteroid belt is not what it is in Empire Strikes Back. There's not asteroids bouncing off of each other and smashing. They have been there for millennia, we're millions of years. There are kilometers of space between every little piece. We've sent many spaceships through the asteroid belt, and not one of them has been damaged. We've sent spaceships literally through Saturn's rings and haven't been damaged. So maybe something the size of this asteroid could bring some shrapnel with it, but it's just that there's no way that could happen. So the asteroid is way too big for any of this to make any sense. What it does create is scale, and it gives the astronauts an ability to walk around and operate. Obviously, the gravity that we see them walking with is exactly the same as Earth, but they make the argument that they have some thrusters, like it's this throwaway line that they have thrusters on their suits, which is insane, but okay, fine. If that's how you want to wave that away, that's fine. But still, the gravity would be extremely weak. Like, you think the moon is 1/6 of our gravity. So divide that by 3, we're now talking 1/18 of Earth's gravity on this asteroid. And here's the other thing. The shape of the asteroid also doesn't make any sense. Gravity at that size, a mass that size, the gravity would pull it into a sphere. The Ceres asteroid is a sphere, like a planet. It's quote unquote a dwarf planet. Most moons around most of our planets are spheres, even the ones that are smaller than this so-called asteroid. So the moon, like if you look at the size and diameter of, let's say, Pluto's moon, Charon, this asteroid is bigger than that. And it's this jagged, scary-ass looking weird piece of planet that doesn't make any sense. So I imagine when they were designing this asteroid, Michael Bay said to him, it basically has to look like a chunk of another planet from another solar system that was ejected into this place. That's the only design that's the only design advice I can imagine that was given to whoever created that asteroid. Okay. I know I'm really going on a rant, but I just wanted to, learning about the logistics of asteroids just really made me giggle thinking about how completely inaccurate this asteroid is. So then you have to say, okay, so it's not spherical. Maybe it's a chunk of another planet that arrived, billions of years ago into our solar system and finally found its way to Earth, let's say. Okay, why is there so much debris? Oh, it's passing by the moon. Okay, maybe pull a few pieces, but that's not really how that's going to work. There would be no geological activity, even if it's getting that close to the sun. Doesn't make any sense. And all that time would definitely, even if it was a chunk of another planet, clearly not from anywhere in our solar system, otherwise we would know about it, but it's a chunk from another planet from another solar system. It would take millions and millions of years to make it to us. By then, it would absolutely be turned into a sphere. Okay, so what could the asteroid actually be then? It's not a comet. It's not an asteroid. It's not a dwarf planet, which is what it, by their own admission on the size, it would be. It would be at least a dwarf planet, but it clearly doesn't look like a dwarf planet. So what is it? And I argue it's an alien spacecraft, or it's an alien itself. Now, this is obviously, I'm being facetious here. That is clearly, at no point do they hint that the asteroid is alive in any real sense. Obviously, there's a few lines about, it knows we're here to kill it. And when Bruce Willis is alone on the asteroid, he keeps taunting it. But clearly none of that. It is no way inferring that there is an alien life under there. It's just having fun with the sound design and the action. So, and I'm going to talk about the final illogical thing about Armageddon. They have to drill to 800 feet. Now, I want you to remember, they said it's the size of Texas. A planet that big, 800 feet, isn't even a kilometer. They are trying to drill into a fault line, this imaginary fault line that exists. And, okay, so they do that. They drill 800 feet into this asteroid, which is hurtling towards Earth, and it would have to break apart so far to pass by Earth when it is so close. I know they have the whole thing about the zero barrier, but zero barrier probably would have had to start at like Mars. By the time it gets to the moon, it wouldn't. There's no way you could break it apart enough that it would skip by the Earth. But if they do that, then you don't have a movie. Um, okay, so they drill to 800 feet, and then they stick the smallest goddamn nuclear bomb I've ever seen down this tiny little hole. And I understand nuclear bombs pack a punch, and they can, you know, there's something called the Tsar bomb that Russia let off in the 50s, and it's the biggest man-made explosion in history. And just look at a chart of it compared to Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and it'll literally make your skin crawl with how big it was. I don't know how they didn't destroy the planet setting that off, and why they were allowed to. But even if they were able to get the Tsar bomb to explode in the middle of the asteroid, that is nowhere near the depth needed, and a fault line. You couldn't throw a nuclear bomb into the Grand Canyon and just blow a chunk of Arizona into space. That just wouldn't happen. That's not how. And I did some calculations. The amount of nuclear arsenal doesn't even exist that would be needed to blow this asteroid apart. You would need Death Star capable firepower. We're talking kyber crystals to even have a chance of that blowing apart the way that they want to. And I mean, let's not forget the incredible explosion, and even puts the Death Star explosion to shame. That great green shockwave, that green-blue shockwave that happens after Bruce Willis pulls the trigger. That's like one of my favorite shots, maybe in any movie ever, is that shockwave. But again, that explosion wouldn't be anywhere near that. There's no shockwave in space, even with a nuclear bomb. But that's okay. They have to tell the story. And listen, this is a NASA movie. That's the thing too, right? Is that these people are telling me, hey, this is a NASA movie. We've done the research. We filmed at the real Kennedy Space Center. We filmed at real space shuttles. We're trying to make this as plausible as possible. What would NASA do if this really happened? And we go, no, none of this can happen. All of this is completely impossible. But it's fun. And like I said, Armageddon is literally one of my favorite movies of all time. And despite its faults, all these things I know about it, I still love it. I think it's just one long montage after another. One sort of music cue into the next. One needle drop. There's so many characters, all funny, all enjoyable. The film is incredibly entertaining. And then, of course, you have the big heartfelt moment, which is what I think cemented it in film history. That great iconic moment between Ben Affleck and Bruce Willis, where Bruce Willis sacrifices himself for his would-be cocky son-in-law. I have to say, I have 2 daughters. The idea that I would ever sacrifice myself, even if the world was ending, for my future son-in-law, I don't know about that. I do not know about that. But I understand they had to do it for the story. And that's certainly not something I thought about when I was a kid watching this film. I was like, oh my God, that's so touching. Now I am a father. I'm a girl dad. I'm like, are you kidding me? My daughter's boyfriend, I'm going to sacrifice myself for? When he could die a hero, and then I could just be proud of him forever? And my daughter would be sad, but at least now she would have something to compare to and say, I can't be with anybody else because he was the greatest of all time. That's how I would play it. Like, listen, AJ, I'm sorry. I know the right thing is to let you live because you're younger and have so much more of your life ahead of you. But the way this is going to benefit my daughter, I can't ignore that. You're going to have to stay on the asteroid. You're going to have to be the hero. Plus, you're thinner. You can probably fit down the hole better than I can. But yeah, so that's my angle on Armageddon. It's fun to just think about the scientific inaccuracies with a lot of fun. Like I said, there is nothing that's ever existed in our galaxy that resembles anything like that asteroid. Um, so, just take this with a grain of salt. Enjoy Armageddon for what it is. I certainly do, but also laugh at just how ridiculous it is at the same time. And if you hate it, you're one of those people, I don't blame you as well. But I love it. So thank you for watching. Subscribe, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Thank you.